1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 31. Jared just read Jeremiah 9, 23 through 24, and that is the passage from which Paul is quoting when you get to the end of chapter 1 of 1 Corinthians. To sum up what was just read out of Jeremiah, we would say this: let he who glories glory in the Lord. Let he who glories glory in the Lord. If you were to summarize the teaching of John the Baptizer, you would quote him in where he said, I must become less and he must become greater. He must become greater and I must become less. Whenever you love something, it means you have to leave something else out. Whenever you cling to something, it means you have to hate something else. I love my wife. That means I have to put away every other woman in the world. You love your spouse. You made vows to your spouse. You pledged your life. And that means until death do you part, you are to remain with that spouse. We have in our family what we call carnivore night. And it's a weird habit, but it's what happens when you've got 5 boys. And what happens is we pull out our smoker, and I'm not a good guy with a meat smoker. I don't know what I'm doing. But we'll pull out that smoker, and all day we'll smoke ribs, and we'll smoke a roast, and we'll smoke a whole chicken, and whatever else I can figure out how to stick in there. And so we'll make that meal. And I learned after the first time I did that a salad and any vegetable was a total waste. Because every one of those boys ate nothing but meat. There's only so much room here. And you don't want to waste it with vegetables, right? Until you get a little bit older and you realize about health. That's what I'm talking about when I quote 1 Corinthians 1 and 31 and John the Baptizer. There's only so much room, not here, but here. There's only much room here. And if God is not first in your life, God will not be in your life. You can't love God and mammon. You can't love God and the world. You must love God and put Him first in everything that you do. And talking about how if you cling to one, you have to despise the other, let's notice real quick just a few verses about pride in the Bible. In many ways, we could say every sin comes back to pride. Notice what God says about pride. In 1 Corinthians chapter 6, looking at verse 16, here are the things that are an abomination to the Lord: a proud look, lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood. Psalm 101, verse 5, he who has a haughty look and a proud heart, the Lord says, him I will not endure. Proverbs 16, verse 5, everyone proud in their heart is an abomination to the Lord. Isaiah 2:11, the lofty looks of man shall be humbled, the haughtiness of man shall be bowed down, and the Lord alone shall be exalted on that last day. Luke chapter 16 and verse 15, Jesus says, you are those who justify yourselves before men, but God knows your hearts. For what is highly esteemed among men is an abomination before the Lord. In Acts chapter 2 and verse 23, we read about where Herod is struck down because he thought he was a god because of the things the other people were saying. And yet the Lord struck him down because of his haughtiness. Now, let's focus out a little bit more. If you're looking through the book of 1 Corinthians, what's the issue? Of course, Paul talks about marriage. Paul talks about people suing one another. Paul talks about disfellowshipping because some of the members of the church were sexually immoral. Paul talks about being stumbling stones. Paul talks about messing up about the spiritual gifts and all these things. You boil everything down in 1 Corinthians, it comes down to pride. Listen to these verses out of 1 Corinthians and let me show you. 1 Corinthians 1:29. God did these things that no flesh should glory in his presence. 1 Corinthians 1:31, as it is written, he who glories, let him glory in the Lord. 1 Corinthians 3 and verse 7, so then neither he who plants anything, nor he who waters, is anything, but it is God who gives the increase. 1 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 6. Now these things, brethren, I have figuratively transferred to myself and Apollos for your sakes, that you may learn in us not to think beyond what is written, that none of you should be puffed up on his behalf against one another. 1 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 2. And you are puffed up. Have not rather you should mourn, for he who has done this deed should be taken away from among you. Chapter 8 and verse 1, concerning these things offered to idols, we know that we have all knowledge. But remember, knowledge puffs up, but love edifies. 1 Corinthians 13:4, love suffers long and is kind. Love does not envy. Love does not parade itself. Love is not puffed up. Now, for the sake of this lesson, I've left out 7 instances in 1 Corinthians talking about pride, and I've left out 6 instances in 2 Corinthians talking about pride. But I wanted to get the point across. If you go through Corinthians, every sin, every problem happening in that church revolved around pride. Here we are 2,000 years later. And let me tell you, every instance and every problem that arises in the Lord's church, pride. Bring that down further. Everything that I wrestle with spiritually, and every issue I have in my life, and every issue you have in your life, likely revolves around pride. What is pride? Pride is boasting about yourself and not boasting about the Lord. Pride is taking credit for what God has done. Pride is relying upon yourself and not on God. Pride is relying upon your own self-sufficiency, upon your own strength, and not realizing it's God who gives the victory. Pride is accentuating what you do well and ignoring the places and where you need to grow. So in this lesson, let's look at 5 reasons or 5 ways to combat pride in your life. 5 ways that we as a church, each one of us individually, can combat pride. First, look in chapter 1 and verse 22. Recognize what it is that you boast in. The Jews demanded a sign. That's strength. The Greeks demanded wisdom. That's intelligence. How do we judge our young folks? Here in a few months, Lord willing, our kids will graduate, and we'll begin going through the accomplishments of those kids. And we talk about their strengths. We talk about their intelligence. And in many ways, not just in that way, when we look at one another, we're like, oh man, that person, he is so strong and healthy. That person, he is so smart. And there's times where you and I, going through our lives, judge ourselves, and it suddenly becomes all about us and not about God. We need to put God first and stop relying upon ourselves and realize it's God who gives the victory. Number 2, looking at verse 25. Affirm God's superiority over everything else. Look there in verse 25. For the foolishness of God is wiser than men. No matter how smart we may be, we may build a Tower of Babel. God laughs and he changes languages. We may come up with the greatest nation. God laughs because he sees the church and he sees the end of every nation, Daniel chapter 2. We may think that we can speak with the same authority as Jesus and Paul, and yet we see that the wisdom of men does not measure up to the foolishness of God. Number 3, notice how God describes or deals with human pride. Look there in verse 19. I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the cleverness of the clever I will thwart. Verse 21, it pleased God through the folly of what we preach to save those who believe. Why does God command baptism? What's so big about going up there and dipping yourself underwater? And why is that such a spiritually strong symbolic action? Why does God want his people together every first day of the week to participate in worship? Why does God consistently call me to put myself to death so that Christ can live within me? Those things seem foolish to some people, but it's the wisdom of God because it shows my submission to him. God blocks the way of self-reliance and pride. I want you to imagine today the richest man living, the smartest man living, the most powerful man living. Perhaps it's the president of our country. And I want you to imagine sitting in a room with those three and listening to them about their views of life, about the secrets of how they got to where they got to be, what they did, how they had that key, that secret which is there. And as you're sitting in that room with those three people, imagine in that room if a curtain were to open. And behind that curtain, there's a man wearing very few garments. There's a man hanging on a cross, screaming in agony. There's a man very, very close to death. What would the most powerful man think when he compared himself to that poor, wretched man on the cross? What would that man who had all the money in the world think when he confronted with that person in that situation? What would each of these men compare themselves to as they saw that? And if they were to discuss back and forth, who is it that would be most powerful? Well, you know the answer. And you're showing it by your presence today, and you're showing it by the life that you live, that all the things that this world has to offer will fail. But that man upon the cross, that man who is resurrected, that man who now sits at the right hand of God, is the most powerful, is the most wealthy, is the richest man who shall ever live. And every one of us, no matter how powerful we are, no matter how rich we are, no matter how intelligent we are, every one of us shall bow at the foot of the cross. How do we combat pride? Recognize what it is that you boast in. Describe how it is that God deals with human pride. Affirm the superiority of God over everything else. And number 4, notice who it is that God chooses. Notice who it is that God chooses. Verse 20, where is the wise man? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater? Maybe you are like me on the playground in elementary school. We would sit there and 2 team captains would come up and they would pick everybody and they would pick this person and that person, this person and that person. And sometimes I felt all by myself at the end. And somebody would look at me and say, okay, we'll take him, but we get the ball first. That ever happened to you? Hopefully not. But notice who it is in the Bible that Jesus focuses on and Jesus seeks out. There's a woman caught in adultery. There's a tax collector who's hated by everyone. There's a fisherman who is brash, who says the wrong thing a lot of times. There's the prostitute. There's the sinner. There's the outcast. The world sees them as failures. The world sees them as not worth anything. God says, that's my person. That's who I'm seeking for. That's who I want. You ever think about that? God takes us when we're broken. God takes us when we realize that we can't do it on our own. And God builds us from that point to be what we should be. How do we combat pride? We declare the purpose of God in everything that we do. Look at verse 29. No human, no person can boast in the presence of God. In verse 31, let he who boasts, boast in the Lord. As we close this lesson and as we prepare ourselves to go out this week, I want us to affirm within our hearts and our lives that statement. He must become greater, and I must become less. You ever notice we're identified by worldly things? Some people are identified by the house they live in. Some people are identified by the car that they drive. Some people are identified by their bank account or by their family name. Some people are identified by their job. I always thought it was funny whenever I used to go see a barber. That wasn't that long ago. And that person who was cutting hair or whatever, they'd be talking back and forth, and somebody would say, hey, what do you do for a living? I'd say, I'm a preacher. And they're like, ooh, got to be sure what we say, got to be sure that we behave. You're identified by the work that you do. Let me tell you this day, God, when he sees you, does not see you by your occupation. He doesn't see you by your bank account. He doesn't see you by your address or the car or whatever else it may be. He sees you as loved. And he sees you as a child of God, a potential child of God if you have not yet obeyed the gospel. But what you're called to do is become less of you and more of him. Don't let pride keep you from doing what you should do. Don't let the ways of this world distract you from what's really important.